April 4th, 1997, Riverside Church. That really, Dr. King was assassinated a year later, but that speech that day really put him on the path for his life to end.
The most controversial talk of his life ever. And in that speech, he comes out, it's called Beyond Vietnam. He comes out in that speech and calls America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That's a strong indictment, even from Dr. King, to call America, this is a black man in the 60s, telling America, you, America, are the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He goes on in that speech to talk about what he calls the triple threat of racism, poverty, and militarism. And for that speech, calling America out that way on the Vietnam War, the next day, everybody and everything turns on him. For the last year of his life, literally, from April 4, 67 to April 4, 68, he has a target on his back every day of his life.
Well, I've never believed that it was not a coincidence that he was killed a year to the day of that particular speech, because here you had one of the world's preeminent leaders of peace, of nonviolence, taking such a critical stand. President Lyndon Baines Johnson was very much angry about it. Civil rights leaders were angry with him as well. But what's interesting is that when you read Peniel Joseph's book on Stokely Carmichael of Life, it was really the young folks in SNCC who kept pushing Dr. King on Vietnam as well, because he wasn't that hard on it initially.
Yeah. He'd been out against the war, but you're right. He had not come out and given a major speech on it. But when he did, he paid a heavy price for it. And he loved Stokely. He loved the young students at SNCC. He loved Stokely. They had great debates about tactics, as you well know. Dr. King said black power is a wonderful slogan, but it's not a strategy.
Right.
And nonviolence had been the only strategy that had actually worked for black people. It worked in Montgomery with the bus boycott. It worked at the March on Washington. It worked to get the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act passed. So Dr. King had a strategy that at least had worked, even though a lot of young folk in 67 and 68 thought he was sort of passé. They didn't want to hear about nonviolence. They wanted to hear about a more radical approach. But when King comes out against the war in Vietnam and gives this speech, the media turns on him, including the black media. When you're reading this book with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, we ain't talking about Fox News. We're talking about the liberal media establishment came after him when he gave that speech. And then the White House turns on him, as you said. He and Johnson had worked together for voting in civil rights, but now Johnson is upset with him for contesting him on the Vietnam War question. But then the white Americans turn on him. The last poll taken in his life, the Harris poll, finds that 75%, 3/4 of the American people, thought in the last year of his life that King was irrelevant. But hold your hat. Almost 60% of black people, to your earlier point, almost 60% of us thought he was irrelevant and and persona non grata. So that Roy Wilkins and the NAACP come out against him, Whitney Young and the Urban League come out against him, Ralph Bunche comes out against him, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., straight hater, comes out against him, and I can't even quote on the air here. It's in the book what Thurgood Marshall, yes, that Thurgood Marshall, had to say about Dr. King. It's a story about Dr. King that we don't know, and you don't really know him or Roland or Tavis unless you see us in the dark and difficult days and that was the last year of his life.
Also, economically, he took a tremendous hit as well. He was earning a lot of money when giving various speeches. That began to dry up. That impacts his family, impacts his kids, and he is under duress, if you will. So he is trying to establish this moral authority. But all of a sudden, people say, well, we like the moral authority on that other stuff, but not when it comes to Vietnam.
They basically said to King, Negro, we've given you license to talk about civil rights. That's the lane you run in. You do not talk about foreign policy. Martin was saying that budgets are moral documents. Budgets are moral documents. You don't tell us how to set our spending priorities. Martin is saying that war is the enemy of the poor. The bombs you're dropping in Vietnam are landing in the ghettos and barrios of American cities. And they didn't really want to hear that critique. And so you're right. At the end of his life, he's bankrupt. As you know, Harry Belafonte has to pay for the funeral because Martin has no money. He's got death threats every single day. He feels that death angel hovering in his space. He knows there's a bullet out there with his name on it. We think the mountaintop speech the night before he died was when he all of a sudden realized that he may not get there with us. For the year leading up to that, he was getting death threats and knew every day that his life was in jeopardy. So he wants to organize this Poor People's Campaign here in Washington. He's going to be the original Occupy, not New York and Zuccotti Park. He's coming here to the National Mall with a tent city set up, and they just went after Dr. King. And again, it's a story that I want us to know, because if you really want to appreciate him, you got to see what we did to him in the last year of his life. In many ways, we helped to kill him because we abandoned Dr. King.
Well, even prior to writing this, that was always something that was quite interesting to me. Books that I read, documentaries that I watched, because it spoke loudly to what happens when you show real leadership. Now, some folks will say, well, yeah, holding news conference and protesting is real leadership. This was on a whole different scale, and I don't know if there's any comparison today to take that kind of stand against a president, a country, and the world, and you putting all of it on the line.
Yeah. Well, I think there really isn't a comparison, because Dr. King was so far ahead of his time. Here we are almost 50 years after his death. And for all the hell and hate that he caught then, it's abundantly clear he was right about practically everything he said. And so part of what we have to understand is that you can love a president and support a president and vote for a president. King and Johnson had worked together very well, as I said earlier, on voting in civil rights. But on this issue, King and he parted ways. And King was able to stand in his truth and to tell Johnson what he thought about the war in Vietnam.
It is a difficult thing for people to go against an ally, somebody who you wanted there. In the case of Dr. King, to your point, there was an alliance there with President Johnson when it came to opposing Barry Goldwater in terms of campaigning, if you will. And so compare the courage to take on a president when many people say you're absolutely crazy to do so because that's an ally. You don't want to tick off a powerful person like that.
Well, this is what's so depressing about the story. Dr. King comes out against the war in Vietnam. I mean, you have the NAACP. I mean, it's hard for black folk to wrap our brains around this all these years later. That's why the story is so important. When the NAACP and the Urban League and Ralph Bunche and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Thurgood Marshall and Carl Rowan and the black media went after Dr. King in the last year of his life. We don't know this story.
So you had no protection of the black infrastructure?
None. He couldn't get into a black church. He couldn't get a speech. He was bankrupt. He couldn't write a book. He couldn't get his book published. He couldn't get a magazine to run an excerpt from his text. He couldn't get an op-ed in the newspaper. They turned on him quicker than right now and sooner than that once he delivered that particular speech. So to your question about checking presidents and about trying to hold them accountable, when you read in the book again what King said to Johnson, it will blow your mind. I mean, I've never heard you or myself or Cornel West or any of us say anything near what Dr. King said to Lyndon Johnson. Again, always in love, never name calling, but always holding Johnson accountable. So here's my point, that great presidents aren't born. Great presidents are made. They have to be pushed into their greatness. There is no Abraham Lincoln without Frederick Douglass pushing him. There is no FDR without A. Philip Randolph pushing him. There is no LBJ without MLK pushing him. And so left to their own devices, presidents, all 44 of them, end up being garden variety politicians and not statesmen. They end up being transactional and not transformational if somebody lovingly and respectfully doesn't hold them accountable and push them into their greatness.
If you look at what Dr. King was talking about, it all played out because what he was laying out is the resources that we were placing on Vietnam were dollars that, frankly, were not available to spend in the United States. If you come present day, the resources that we spent saving Wall Street, when it came to TARP, when it came to bailing out the banks, were not about Main Street. We still see the tremendous housing crisis. We saw 53% of black wealth wiped out. Here we are also now during airstrikes against Syria. And again, you're sort of operating in this same worldview. That is a time of war in Dr. King's last year, spending resources. And then today, where people say we don't have money to fund this, but it took them that long to find $500 million to fund what's happening in Syria. That's
why if King were here, he'd still be talking about that triple threat, as he called it, the triple threat of racism, poverty, and militarism. As I said earlier, King repeatedly that war is the enemy of the poor. And that was his critique of Johnson. So on the one hand, President Johnson says, Dr. King, you called for a war on poverty, but now you're engaged in a war in Vietnam. Well, those two things are hard to juxtapose, because if you're serious about a war on poverty, you can't be squandering resources on a war in Vietnam. And so we see the same thing happening today, as you just astutely noted, that whenever they want to find money for something, they find it. But when it comes to eradicating poverty, poverty is threatening our very democracy now. It's a matter of national security as far as I'm concerned. And if King were here right now, Lord help us, he'd have a critique in this moment of the military-industrial complex in this country that's on steroids, and people would still be throwing rocks at him right now. But he'd still be standing up, speaking his truth, and that's what's so beautiful about the story. King goes through all this hell and all this hate, starting April 4, 67, when he gives the speech, to the minute he takes that bullet to the head, April 4, 68. You know what the beautiful part of it is? Every day this Negro wakes up, he keeps telling the truth. When people don't want to hear it, he keeps telling it. When they don't believe him, he keeps telling it. When they don't like him, he keeps telling it. When they turn him off, he keeps telling it. Every day of his life, he keeps telling the truth. And all these years later, history has absolved him for being the truth teller that he was. So the point very quickly is that societies pay a price. I hope this is a cautionary tale from the book, that there's a huge price that we pay as a society when we ignore our truth tellers on the environment, on poverty, on the use of drones. We have to listen to our truth tellers, or we pay a heavy price for that long term.
Well, but it's interesting because, again, people always say people always say we want people to speak truth. We want them to give it straight, no chaser. But then when folks do, all of a sudden folks are like, whoa, that's a little too much. And so I've always said, even with our politicians, I say we really don't want them speaking hardcore truth. We want them to actually make us feel a little good, because if they go there, I don't think we could be able to handle that much truth.
I think black people have been unloved for so long that when they hear a critique that's really based on their best interest and on a deep and abiding love for them, it's hard to process that because they've been exploited so many years.
Hey fam, want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered, the blackest show on all of digital, cable, and broadcast. Check out our audio podcast. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Press play. You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. You want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it. You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.